started by much of, if you will, mainstream Catholicism, which itself, of course, is formed by its religious authorities and clergy, also negatively. And so, for example, many of them were silenced. Many of them could not write about any longer the things they were interested in or had to switch fields. Or somebody like Teilhard de Chardin decided to go off to China. But that was more actually going into the wilderness, in contrast to the Prophet Muhammad, who said, "Seek ye knowledge even unto China." So it was a whole different approach to how one was going off to China. And the reality of it is that right up to Vatican II, there was a tremendous fight within the religious authority, often between conservative clergy and laity. And you could see that even after Vatican II, in the debate over, for example, the birth control encyclical, when in fact you would suddenly have people say, well, wait a minute, you're not ordained. So you have a PhD in religion or theology, but you're not ordained and you didn't do your work at a seminary. Therefore, you shouldn't have the authority of religious leaders. And you see many of the ulama, or the religious scholars in Islam, when they feel under siege, saying the same thing. We're the ones who are the traditional holders and interpreters. We're the ones who should interpret. Now, when we actually look at the way in which and the world in which reformers function today, remember that there are significant obstacles. One, repressive authoritarian regimes who basically see all fundamental reform and any form of power sharing, rule of law, democratization, and an approach to power sharing and democratization that appeals to Islam, which makes it even more difficult and dangerous from the point of view of reformers, as threatening their power. And that's why often governments like to co-opt religion. Either the government, the head of the government will himself interpret religion, or they will interpret the grand muftis of their country, the heads of seminaries, not interpret, but appoint. Then we have the issue of religious extremists in societies. They believe they have a mandate from God, not simply to push their point of view, but to impose it and destroy anyone who disagrees with them. And so religious extremists do not only see people of other faith as a problem and a problem to be done away with, but also members of their own faith. And we see that playing out often on the ground in Muslim countries. Then those who I referred to just briefly a moment ago, intransigent religious conservatives. Not all, but many. They're well-meaning, but wedded to what was a classical paradigm and often now what looks like a medieval paradigm. Often they are co-opted by their governments and use their religious authority to delegitimate reforms as heresy and to legitimate their own governments. One can again think of, for example, the Catholic hierarchy in North America, when caught between reformers, particularly liberation theologians, and authoritarian governments. At the heart of, from my point of view, the debate for reform is the question of text and context. Do you recognize that a sacred text like the Quran is meant to be, not only needs to be, but is meant to be interpreted and reinterpreted in different contexts? Or do you buy into the idea that interpretations that occurred during a past classical period and that were perhaps very appropriate then are somehow a kind of fixed sacred tradition? Connected with that, then, is your attitude towards your tradition. And again, there's a parallelism here. When you talk to Muslims as when you talk to Catholics, there's a reference to, if you will, the revealed scripture, and then tradition, Islamic tradition, Christian tradition, which is a whole set of beliefs, outlooks that develop over decades and centuries, come to be somewhat fixed, and then are followed for centuries. And then the issue becomes what happens when you begin to question that tradition that's become almost sacralized. Can people any longer distinguish between the notion that that tradition is based not only on sacred texts, but human interpretations? In which interpretations are in or out? I'll give you a controversial example of this. Within Islam today, you have both people who can be called traditionalists, but maybe neo-traditionalists, because they're people whose methodology is to still operate by a very traditional legal methodology, but they take that methodology and they mine it in such a way that they can come up with new and fresh interpretations. And then you have others who see tradition as a reference point, but they don't sacralize it. And so they're more, if you will, liberal in their methodology. Yet both can often wind up on issues like women's role in society in the same place, but they take a different methodological approach. But where you see the strain, for example, within a neo-traditionalist approach, is to take, for example, a very prominent scholar, long-time convert, British convert, educated at Oxford, Cambridge, a professor at Cambridge today, also educated at Al-Azhar University, also a religious leader, and who uses the following logic in dealing with the question of reform, particularly the ability of women to lead mixed community prayer, the congregational prayer, the Jummah prayer on Friday. I'm not taking a position here on the Jummah prayer. If you want to know my personal position as a non-Muslim, I'll tell you. You can also ask me that as a Roman Catholic, about the role of women in the liturgy. I'll tell you that too. Pretty much it's the same position. But in any case, but the reality of it is, though, you have, for example, this religious scholar who's able to mine the tradition very easily and refer to the bin Ladens of the world, etc., as vigilantes, people who seize the tradition, distort it, etc. When he deals with the question of women leading mixed prayer, he states very candidly, and I think correctly and truthfully, that there is no clear text in the Quran that says that women cannot lead mixed prayer. There is no clear, strong, authoritative set of traditions of the Prophet, what the Prophet said or did, the narrative stories that have been passed down, that would rule it out. But he says it's always been tradition, and therefore that should be followed. And indeed, he says, Muslims should not therefore seek to go back to the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet in order to consider a new interpretation. That's where you get into this push and pull. And this exists in many traditions in terms of religious figures. Somebody's supposed to be holding up a card, give me an idea of how much time I have, but I don't. Either I'm blind or... No, I have less than that. Please. Did you see how many people made a face? What are you doing here? They were all going like this to me already. Now I have 5 minutes. This is great. So we go from Alexa saying 20 minutes, John Voles saying I have 5 minutes. This is what I like. I never trusted a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. He's my best friend, but don't trust him. Okay. All right. Another factor in taking a look at reform is, what do most Muslims believe? And here's where I think things like the Gallup World Poll, and I should tell you, I'm associated with the Gallup World Poll, but what is the largest, most comprehensive poll of Muslim people in 35 to 40 Muslim countries across the world, what they think about their religion in terms of their private life, in terms of society, in terms of progress, in terms of democracy, in terms of gender rights, in terms of terrorism, extremism. It's important to know what people think. It's not enough to simply say, this is what religious authorities say the text says, and this is what religious authorities say, whether they're muftis and imams or popes and bishops. But it's also, what do the majority of believers think? How do they see their faith? How are they practicing their faith? Otherwise, you wind up with somebody saying something like, well, in the 8th century, Muslims did this. Or, Sayyid Qutb said that. They still cite Sayyid Qutb as if it was just yesterday. He died about 50 years ago. So one has to look at, what do Muslim believers also think today in terms of moving forward? And when we do that, we see some interesting things. For example, if you talk about women's role, you can talk about what are the theologians saying about women's role in Islam. Very legitimate. But also, what do most Muslims want? What do they believe is in line with their faith? Well, most Muslims want to see greater power sharing, democratization. They want to see rule of law. They want to see gender equality. And so when majorities of Muslims are asked, majorities of Muslims respond, both men and women, including countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran, saying that women should be equal citizens, have equal education, have equal access to jobs, even senior jobs in government. Now, when you then want to say, how come they don't have that?